welcome to McKinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahilly, McKinsey's editorial director and your host for today's event, The State of Fashion, Trends That Matter in 2025. Before we start, quick heads up that our goal with this series of live events is to give you the chance to engage with experts on our latest research. Obviously, asking questions is a big part of that. So if you are registered for this event, please feel free to use the Q&A bar at the bottom of your live stream to ask whatever is on your mind. Today, what's next for the fashion industry? I live in New York City, where anyone intrepid enough to brave the hideous bracing cold last week may have noticed the preponderance of street style that signal New York's biannual fashion week. Joining us today to pull the lens back from the catwalk and talk at the industry level about trends to come this year are two of our top consumer and retail leaders, Gemma and Anita Balchandani. Gemma is global co-leader of our work in the apparel, fashion, and luxury sector, and she serves clients worldwide on a range of topics from growth to customer experience to AI and digital transformation and more. Gemma is based in Milan, Italy. Anita is based in London, also a global fashion capital. She leads our consumer practice in the UK and our apparel, fashion, luxury practice in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Anita has deep expertise across not just fashion, but health and beauty, department stores, specialty retail across geographies, and so on. Gemma and Anita, welcome to McKinsey Live.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's so great to have you, and thank you for being together with us at such a busy time. Before we get into the specifics of the State of Fashion report, let's start with just a little bit of context on the research itself. Anita, this is your 7th year, I believe, doing State of Fashion. You've been involved since the halcyon days pre-pandemic, so you've got the long view here. Any reflections on the report generally and McKinsey's overall collaboration with the business of fashion?
Great. That's a fantastic question to kick us off with. And really, the original genesis of the idea behind this report was, how could we bring together the strengths of business and of fashion, which has an incredible point of view in this industry, as well as the strengths of McKinsey, powered really by our deep analytics and all of our work in this space? How do we combine the two forces and really create something that becomes a flagship industry-wide publication that sets the tone for the year ahead? And I think it's with great pride and privilege that we say that over the years, we have really continued to build the momentum. And I feel actually the halcyon days are, with us today and ahead of us as well, because we do feel that in partnership with the BOF, we have sort of really made this a standout report that the industry looks forward to, and also gives us a really relevant set of topics that we could engage with through the course of the year. So our spirit is also to keep the conversation alive and for it to be quite dynamic. And just as a final sort of add, we do look back at the years that have gone past and often ask ourselves, did we get it right? And actually, we're also sort of quite pleased to say that, in many cases, that is absolutely the case. And if anything, we pride ourselves on calling some of the trends a bit early rather than a bit late. So it's always an exciting partnership, and look forward to discussing some of the topics today.
Thank you, Anita. That's super helpful framing. And folks can see that there's a QR code on screen that you can scan if you want to access the report for the details we're poised to get into. Now let's turn a little bit more explicitly to the research itself and what's at play for fashion in 2025. We're all obviously navigating a world in flux, given various dynamics, Gen AI, macroeconomic uncertainty, rising geopolitical volatility, and so on. That constellation of uncertainties continues to translate into a pretty challenging operating environment for business leaders generally. Gemma, what does it mean for the fashion industry in particular?
Yes, thank you very much, Lucia, for the question. So I'm going to paint a picture that is maybe a little bit, I would say, a glass half empty. And then I will rely on Anita to give you the glass half full view. But in short, this is a time of incredible uncertainty because the world is facing a number of, frankly, unprecedented challenges. One, as we can see on this page, consumer confidence has hit all-time low, particularly in some geographies, China probably being the one that comes most to mind, but frankly, pretty much across the board. By the way, even fashion executives are very pessimistic. So when we did the survey for the report, only 20% of them expected consumer sentiment to improve, and 40% actually expected things to worsen. So in general, this pessimism is not only on the part of consumers, but also fashion executives. And we expect to have only revenue growth in the low single digits, pretty much across the globe, with a few bright spots. We'll talk about them in a little while, like, for example, the US. And in an industry where economic profit is highly concentrated, because this is an industry where value creation, literally, I mean, we have a situation where almost 90% of the economic profit of the entire industry sits with one group, which in this case is LVMH. We see that in 2024, for the first time since 2010, with the exception of COVID, non-luxury will drive the entirety of economic profit. And there are a few things that maybe are just worthwhile mentioning in that. One is there is a shift there's not only low consumer sentiment, but there is a clear shift in appetite to spend and in consumption patterns. So, for example, we have seen that, increasingly adoption of cost-conscious behaviors. We have seen affordability fueling growth in segments such as resale, off-price, outlet stores, and even the rise of dupes that before were almost like worn with shame, and now that they're sort of worn with pride, which again was a phenomenon we were not expecting. And then, as we can see here, not only they're going to be more cost conscious, they're actually going to also be, spending less on goods and much more on experiences, whether that's travel, gastronomic experiences, cultural experiences, you name it. Another element that I want to highlight is that there has been continued reshuffling of global trade patterns. And we have seen already, even before the US elections and all the latest sort of, this conversation on tariffs, we did see a huge increase in trade restrictions over the last couple of years. And this has driven a lot of reconfiguration of supply chains and sourcing and, nearshoring in places like Turkey for Europe or Mexico for the Americas. And the last thing I will mention, just because it's something that is also quite clear in the industry, is talent shortages. And it's both a challenge on the creative side, but also on the business side. And we talk about this both. I mean, I know that we're focused on fashion today, but we will make some, comments about luxury, because we also published in January our State of Luxury report with the business of fashion. It's the first time we actually published a deep dive on the luxury industry with them. And you will see that some of these elements, for example, the acceleration of experience or the reshuffling of talent, are common to both the fashion and the luxury industry.
Super helpful. Thank you, Gemma. That's very interesting. You mentioned the rise in cost consciousness there, which I made a mental note to take under advisement vis-a-vis my own habits. Anita, let's turn now to the glass half full point of view. What do the findings mean for executives who are looking for bright spots to focus on in the coming year?
That's a great question. And as Gemma said, I'll focus on the glass half full, actually. But before that, I personally find that being cost conscious, at least, is somewhere where habits die hard. So maybe I will learn to do things differently, but there's absolutely no sign of that at the moment. So why do, look, we all hear and read, and Gemma laid out really well sort of some of the backdrop in which we're operating and how executives are feeling. That said, I'd like to make a case for optimism here. And that comes from the following reasons. Firstly, actually, when we look at the margin structure of the industry, it has proven to be remarkably resilient. So, notwithstanding the demand headwinds and the slowdown, actually, this is an industry where economic profit overall stepped up. And when we've looked at the margin analysis by subsector, in across all of the sectors, bar luxury. So, if we look at mid-market, value, premium, this industry has actually seen percentage margins step up, um, even in a challenging time. And while luxury is under pressure, underlying intrinsically, the margin rates in luxury also still remain fairly resilient. And this year, we're also seeing much less polarization in that spread of economic profit. So I think actually the industry starts off on a positive note in terms of margin resilience. And if anything, in one of the CEO breakfasts we hosted the other day, the conversation went along the lines of, could this be the wake-up call that the industry needs to really get stronger and better by capitalizing on the technology shifts, the growth pockets in demand, etc.? Does it just force the industry to operate at a much higher level of performance and focus than it has needed to in the last decade? But if we just very tangibly look at where do you go from growth in this landscape, if I apply three lenses, there's a customer lens, which is actually, if we look at consumers, segments such as the silver spenders, the over 55s, for example, account for 72% of all the wealth in North America. And increasingly, the demographics in many geographies, including China, are really sort of heading towards the older generation that we, in the report, call the silver spenders. And we do believe this is a buoyant and robust sort of base of which to, focus a business. And many of the brands that have been really successful recently have also done a fine job of creating multi-generational appeal. So they're appealing to the younger customers, but frankly, they've unlocked a recipe to also be relevant to the older ones. So I think we'd look at consumer segments. If we then look at industry or category subsegments, this is the first time since we've published the State of Fashion report that the mid-market segment has actually been in growth, both in revenue, but also in economic profit terms. So it tells us that actually, given how consumers are feeling about value, many of the transformation efforts of the mid-market brands that have been around, and by the way, some years ago were really struggling, we're actually seeing that come to bear. So this is a moment for mid-market. Value consciousness of value and off-price is also another channel where we're seeing, real sort of consumer demand and appetite. And then segments such as sports, beauty, which is absolutely an adjacency into this area, and many fashion and luxury players are also entering that space. If you think about sports, many of the insurgent brands in sports now account for close to 60% of the economic profit. This is not just a game that is being won by the incumbents and the big brands. So we do believe there are actually many of these category niches and value positioning segments that are robust and in growth. And then last but by no means least are, if you apply a geographic lens, the US remains resilient, and Gemma will talk in a second about a bit more of a granularity around, all of the executives actually being quite positive around regions such as India, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Malaysia. So all of these opening up kind of a new lens on Asia beyond China. But actually that might be, Gemma, a great kind of area for you to build on as well, and share where you see some of the real sort of growth highlights.
Yeah, let's turn to that question, Gemma, and where in this context of more broadly decelerating growth, leaders might look for new regions of opportunity. Again, Anita just called out India, which is a focus of the report. It feels like we've been talking about India as the next big market for some years now. What's different about the latest research?
Yeah. So a few thoughts there. By the way, I do agree. I think the silver spenders, will be a very important part of growth. I mean, in fact, they will represent about half the growth going forward, right? That we think in consumer spend. And then we'll talk a little bit later about sports, which I find personally hugely exciting. But I do think, geographically speaking, there are a couple of interesting phenomenon here. India is a very interesting market that we think will play a more prominent role. Why? Because one is it is expected to grow 12 to 17% in the fashion segment and 15 to 20% in the luxury segment in 2025, which basically is, does not even compare to the single digit growth that we see in other markets. It's also been interesting because the inflection point is driven by the fact that one, there is a middle class of aspirational consumers that's 430 million people strong. Just for reference, this is larger than the middle class of the whole Europe and US combined. Two, it is a fast-growing economy with actually a lot of positive consumer sentiment and optimism, which is in stark contrast to what we were discussing before in other markets. It is going to be soon the third largest consumer market in the world. So we're talking about a very deep, potential pool of customers. The ultra high net worth population, albeit from a small base, is the fastest growing in the world. We expect it to grow at 50% between 2023 and 2028, which is phenomenal growth. As I said, of course, from a lower base, but very important. And frankly, there has been a step change in infrastructure in India, and this has also been driving retail development, which in turn has been fueling growth in the industry. Now, of course, and Japan continues to be very interesting. Of course, it was helped by the yen devaluation, but we do think it continues to be a very sophisticated, very important market for many brands. And then there are some hotspots. I mean, they're more like city-based, I would say. So, Bangkok is, increasingly important, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur. So yes, there are some additional hotspots. The one key takeaway, though, from our report is that brands need to take these markets seriously and really lean into these markets, really, take a long-term view. This is not a tactical move. India is extremely complex. There are infrastructure challenges, there are partner selection and operating model challenges, local consumer dynamics, right? Like the occasion wear market is very much dominated by local tastes and preferences. And then there is regulatory requirements on top. So you cannot take any of these markets lightly. And we think they do present opportunities for growth, but we think they need to be really sort of treated with caution and respect that they deserve, and actually be, have a really well thought through go-to-market strategy that's a mid to long-term horizon and not just a short-term horizon.
Thank you, Gemma. That's super helpful. Let's switch gears slightly. Not surprisingly, we've had a number of audience questions on AI, which of course continues to be like the omnipresent topic in CEO discussions, including in broad settings like Davos, and presumably even in more industry-specific ones like New York Fashion Week. Anita, you talked about bright spots. Is AI an opportunity that fashion leaders are taking advantage of? Is the fashion world moving to embrace it? And if so, what are the best use cases? How should leaders be approaching AI at this juncture?
Look, AI and Gen AI, we believe, is sort of one of the biggest opportunities for this industry. And back to the earlier sort of statement around, could this be a moment for the industry kind of as a wake-up call to really think about how the industry operates and make a step change? We believe that kind of data, technology, AI will absolutely be a critical underpin of that. And I'll come on to Gen AI in a moment, but when we talk about AI as an opportunity, in that we absolutely include also data, advanced analytics, traditional AI, and then, of course, you layer on Gen AI, which with, images, and in the world of how do you sort of get desire, across, and how do you create hope with consumers, then we believe in the fashion industry, Gen AI can also play a big role. But equally, we would almost start with where are there opportunities on an advanced analytics and, AI standpoint. And I think, look, you can talk about lots and hundreds of use cases. But we feel often that thinking takes you down a path of some micro improvements, which then become hard for an organization to see where is the difference coming from. So I'd like to step that up a level and to think about three big things and three big areas in which AI could really allow fashion executives to transform the industry. Number one would be, how does data and AI truly enable sort of the end-to-end value chain to be operated at a whole different level of productivity? So if you start to think about how you plan assortment, if you think about how you plan assortment at a store level, how you think about replenishment, etc., and the role that data can play through the value chain to frankly address some of the challenges that the industry faces, right? We know this is an industry that plans to overproduce. 40% of what the industry makes is expected not to be sold. So that in itself creates a huge cost problem and frankly a sustainability problem as well. So actually data and AI that can enable better prediction of bestsellers, better replenishment, better matching of inventory to where the customers are. We think that could be game changers. So thinking about data and AI through the value chain to really step change on productivity. The second big kind of area is, if you think about so much of interaction and engagement with fashion is today also in the digital world. And yet, for those of us who sort of try shopping for or looking and even searching for fashion online, it's quite a list-driven experience. It doesn't have the curation, the inspiration, the personalization that one would expect of the fashion industry. So we do believe that platforms, applications, and players that really enable curation of fashion in a much more personalized way and make that search and discovery genuinely thoughtful and relevant could be an absolute game changer. And then the third area that I'd look to is transforming clienteling. Today, the whole world of clienteling is also still fairly, anchored in great service and an ethos of great service, but very individually oriented, probably quite manual, if you will. And how could AI absolutely make that clienteling journey and arm the personal shopper in store with a whole different degree of information to make it personalized, to make it genuinely 24/7 and really transform that. So those are just three that we pick, but we do believe it's important to take a lens of what are the domains, both from a customer experience standpoint and then from an end-to-end productivity standpoint, what could genuinely transform the industry? And here we do have, a bull case that we put forward. Recognizing that the fashion industry is still at the foothills, frankly, of being able to leverage and optimize AI.
Super interesting. Okay, I'm mindful of time. And again, we're getting lots of questions here from the audience for both of you as leaders in this industry and veterans of this research. Maybe one way of getting at some of the more general questions that are coming in is simply to ask, what was most surprising to each of you in this year's report? And Gemma, let's start with you.
Sure. For me, the most surprising phenomenon that we uncovered here was the one of, in sportswear. More specifically, in 2020, which was 5 short years ago, 80% of the economic profit of the value creation in sports was driven by incumbent brands that have revenues, upwards of $5 billion, right? So the brands that you can imagine, the Nike, Adidas, Puma, Under Armour, and 20% was what we call challenger brands. So smaller brands like On, Lululemon, Deckers, Anta. 2024, by end of 2024, and this is really a short period of time, the contribution of economic profit by the incumbents had halved to 40%. And the challengers had gone up 60%. We have very rarely seen this reversal, this showdown between incumbents and challengers in such a short period of time. So both in terms of quantum as well as in terms of, period of time, it was phenomenal. And for me, one of the key takeaways that I hope, fashion brands more broadly take from this is the importance of innovation and product innovation. I do think that challenger brands really invested above and beyond on that, as well as on authenticity, which is not only part of the DNA of these brands, but also, frankly, it's apparent in the kind of partnerships they decide to strike, in how they communicate to their consumers. I just find that these two have to go hand in hand, and they're absolutely essential for a brand to stay relevant in the long term.
Super interesting. Anita, what about you?
Look, I think I would say for the last several years, everybody has been writing off the mainstream or the mid-market segment. And, that has also shown in the performance numbers of, the players in aggregate in that segment. This is the first year where the mid-market or the mainstream segment actually has sort of really motored ahead, generated a positive, growth. It's been one of the highest growths we've seen in terms of absolute dollars of economic profit. And many players have sort of stepped up their performance / improved very materially. So we do believe the mainstream or mid-market segment is not dead. Actually, that the consumer is sort of really looking for the right level of value and the value equation. And for the players in the mid-market mainstream segment that are getting that right, actually the prize is real. So I would say it was good to see this year, for the first time in a decade, that reversal in the fortunes of the mainstream segment.
Okay. We are getting lots of engagement from the audience, and unfortunately, we are at time. The engagement is both at a high level, questions at a high level, and specific questions. I want to let the audience know we will answer a selection of these when we follow up after this webinar, and we thank you for all your questions and interactions. It's really been exceptional. That brings us to time. Fantastic discussion. Thank you again for joining us today, Anita and Gemma.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And as always, thanks to all of you in our McKinsey Live audience. You'll be able to find a replay of this and previous McKinsey Lives on our website at mckinsey.com/live. And again, you can also visit mckinsey.com for access to the full State of Fashion and the complimentary State of Luxury publications. And stay tuned also for our next McKinsey Live, which is on the Broken Rung, a new book that draws from more than a decade of research on how women can reach their full potential at work. Be sure to join me and the authors, Koylin Ellengrud, Lorena Yee, and Maria Del Mar Martinez, 3 top leaders here at McKinsey, for a special advanced preview of the book, which will hit the market March 11th. See you there. Have a great day or evening, and be well.